Chapter 6, From the Universal to the Personal, A Psychology of Paradox. From The Wise Heart by Jack Kornfield. This is the last chapter of this section. Form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Yet form is form, and emptiness is emptiness. You should know both the universal and the personal, the realm of forms and the freedom to not cling to them. The forms of the world have their place, but in another way there is nothing there. To be free, we need to respect both of these truths. In the simplest language, we are spiritual beings incarnated into human form. We need to remember our zip code as well as our Buddha nature. Any psychology that denies our spiritual nature cannot help us fulfill our deepest potential. But to be true and complete, a spiritual psychology must also honor our human incarnation in the body, in feelings, society, and the earth itself. We are creatures of this paradox, this interpretation of form and emptiness. Buddhist psychology embraces this multi-level perspective. We have seen how consciousness, like light, functions on one level as particles and on another like waves. So too, our existence has both a universal and a personal dimension. This psychological paradox is called the two truths. Sometimes these two dimensions, two truths, are mistranslated as the absolute and the relative. This mistranslation makes it appear that the absolute or universal has higher value than the relative or personal, but they are actually two complementary aspects of reality. Ajahn Chah called an understanding of the universal and personal dimensions essential for awakening. Here is a sixth principle of Buddhist psychology. Our life has universal and personal nature. Both dimensions must be respected if we are to be happy and free. The universal dimension. Experience this world as a bubble, a wave, an illusion, a dream. The universal dimension is the big picture. When we remember the selflessness of all things, our life falls into perspective. The universal dimension reminds us that all things on earth are transitory, tentative, appearing out of emptiness and then disappearing. People who are about to die face this truth. When Michelle, a Buddhist practitioner, was dying of cancer and her body was wasting away, I visited her and she said, "As I was meditating last week, it became clear to me that I am not my body. But then today I realized I was not all the ideas I have about myself either. Nobody is. We have so many ideas about each other based on our age, our personalities, our history, yet they are so tentative. We are only acting that way for a little while." When Shakespeare wrote All the World's a Stage, he saw it so clearly. Michelle was opening to the wisdom of the universal perspective. There is nobility in speaking this truth. Praise and blame, gain and loss, pleasure and pain are always changing. Notice how nothing lasts. It will put your successes and failures into perspective. Ajahn Chah said this to encourage us. His perspective was not nihilistic. He wasn't saying that life doesn't matter, but very practical. When the food was scanty and bad at the monastery, when the monsoon rains seemed endless, when news of the world brought grief, when certain monks got into conflict, Ajahn Chah offered a more universal perspective. We are not here just to gain pleasure and avoid any pain, Ajahn Chah would say. No one can do that for very long, right? We are here to grow in wisdom and compassion, to grow in the path of awakening. Just remember the universal truth, then everything gets easier. From the universal perspective, all things that are born eventually die. Death comes to our best friends and family members, sometimes even to young children. When we grieve, we join in the universal grieving for all those who have died. This is not a tragedy, it is wisdom. From the universal perspective, life is all the more precious and beautiful because it is so fleeting. One of my teachers, Maha Ghosananda, was known as the Gandhi of Cambodia. He worked with those who had survived the 1975 to 88 genocide in Cambodia when the country was taken over by radical Khmer Rouge communists who killed 2 million people, including almost everyone who was educated. Those left alive after this Holocaust had witnessed their villages and temples burned and their families killed. Wherever he went, Ghosananda would teach the survivors practices of compassion and loving kindness for their own loss and the sorrows of everyone else who had suffered as they had. Then he would get them to chant with him, "Everything that arises passes away." He went on, "You have lost so much. Now you know how precious everything is in this world. You must love again and let new things grow. Gosananda saw their secret beauty and resilient spirit. He encouraged them to rebuild their communities, recreate temples and schools, and find caring families for the orphaned children. The same universal healing was needed for Carla, whose best friend died in the same car accident in which Carla was hurt. The tire blew out on the car just ahead. It was no one's fault. Death happens. Carla needed to grieve, to heal, to remake her life. Over the months, her meditations helped her to grieve. Through her Buddhist practice, Carla began to reflect on the universal nature of birth and death. She saw how death comes to everyone all around the world, whether expected or not. It helped her pass through the trauma and grief and begin again. Without a big picture, the inevitable changes in life can overwhelm us. But when we lose a job or win a promotion, end a marriage, have a grandchild, get sick or get well, it is not just personal, it is the dance of life. This broad perspective is especially important in the most extreme crises. Recently, I shared an evening's teaching with Pima Chodron in San Francisco. During the question period, a woman asked about the suicide of her partner several weeks before. The rawness of her grief was agonizing. Pima began with the need for compassion. After that, I added ways to help her release guilt and find forgiveness. Then I asked how many others among the 3,000 present in that auditorium had had a family member or close loved one die from suicide. Almost 300 people stood up. I suggested that the bereaved questioner look around and feel the compassion and support they offered her. The room became silent. It was a powerful moment for everyone to share. When I work with parents who have lost children, I send them to groups of other bereaved parents. They need to be with others who have survived such grievous loss, to learn that sometimes, no matter what we do in this life, children die. When I work with veterans or suicide survivors or anorexics, I recommend that they form a connection with others who share their experience. When we share our suffering, we remember that it is no longer me or them, but us. Both Buddhist and Western psychology understand the healing power of a universal perspective. The sacredness of form. Teach us to care and not to care. By T.S. Eliot. If you tell a Zen master everything is like a dream, she will take her stick and whack you over the head. Then she will ask, is that a dream? Focusing on the big picture alone is not enough. Form must be honored. A mature psychology requires us to see life from multiple perspectives. Ajahn Chah demonstrated this when he held out his hand fully open, flat, and explained that you can rest things on an open hand, but its use is limited. Similarly, if you hold it fully closed, it can strike things, but its use is also very limited. It is only because we can open and close our hand in response to circumstances that our hand works for us. Sometimes people make the mistake of clinging to the universal level. Like the always open hand, this is a problem. Buddhist texts say that form arises out of emptiness, yet the world of form must be met on its own terms. This is sometimes called suchness. Things are the way they are. From the universal level, we have to return to the world of form and particulars without being caught in them. Once a villager came to Ajahn Chah to ask for help with a woman who had lost her mind. In the West, we might call her manic or delusional. For days she had been wildly spouting obscenities mixed with Buddhist teachings on emptiness, running around up all night disturbing everyone. Many of the villagers felt she was possessed by an evil spirit. Ajahn Chah said he would see her. He told his monks to quickly dig a big hole next to where he sat. Other monks built a big fire. Put a huge water pot on the fire, he said. Soon a group of men and women pulled the poor woman to him and asked him to rid her of the evil spirit. Ajahn Chah tried to talk to her, but she continued shouting obscenities and talking about emptiness and meaninglessness. He told the monks to hurry up and make the fire hotter and dig the hole deeper. He said that the only way to get rid of such a spirit was to put the woman in the hole, pour boiling water on her, and bury her. That should do it, he said. As the water got hot, he said, you can carry her there in a minute. All of a sudden, the woman became very quiet and docile. She sat up and talked a bit to him. He sent most of the people away and began to ask what had happened, listening with real compassion. He heard her whole story. Later, he told the superstitious villagers that fear of boiling to death had released her from the evil spirit. What it had really done, he told us, was awaken her instinct for self-preservation. Then he could begin to listen to her and direct her to the help she needed. This is not to suggest that such a radical intervention would be right in our circumstances. Within his cultural context, Ajahn Chah was a kind of shaman. He knew that something in this woman's life had to die. Because Ajahn Chah knew that form is empty, he could play with it in an intuitive and wise way. Yet he never forgot the importance of honoring the tangible realities of the world. On one level, everything is like a dream. On another, what we do matters immensely. When I came back to the United States after my years in the monastery, which had included a year-long silent retreat, I was lost in the universal side. My mind was silent and empty, and everything appeared quite dreamlike. From this perspective, the Western world seemed speedy and driven. It was appallingly materialistic, filled with images of violence, obsessed with success. It seemed to have lost its spiritual understanding altogether. I had no idea how to fit back in. In my book, A Path with Heart, I told the story of going to meet my sister-in-law at Elizabeth Arden in New York. I was still in monk's robes, and when I went upstairs to wait at the spa, it was hard to tell who looked weirder, me, a barefoot, shaven-headed mendicant, or the women with avocado and mud on their faces and their hair in fishing reel contraptions. After 5 years in Thailand, it was hard to re-enter the world of form. I had to get a job, find a place to live, open a bank account, make 1,000 decisions. I struggled with all these details because they didn't seem to matter very much in the big picture. Later, I heard a story about Taizan Maizumi Roshi, who asked a student carpenter whether the remodeling of the zendo would be done soon. "It's basically done," replied the student. "There are just some details to finish up." The Zen master stood shocked for a moment and then announced, "But details are all there are." It took me years of work and practice in the world to learn respect for the details of work and money and relationship. Since then, as a teacher, I have seen many people like myself who have used spirituality as a way to avoid the world of form. There was Mark, an aging but charming Sufi practitioner, a house sitter and gardener. Mark had fathered a child in Germany, but he never paid any attention to him, never had any money to share with him. To Mark, it was all a part of God's dance, a dreamlike play. But when he was honest, Mark actually wanted a home, a settled life, but didn't know how to do it. And there was Teresa, whose depression was reinforced by the Buddhist teachings of suffering and impermanence. Teresa didn't know how to make the changes that would have transformed her life, so she justified her stuckness with spiritual platitudes. "It's all just impermanent and empty," she would say, to make herself feel better. The problem was that Teresa and Mark were not happy in their choices. Their past wounds and trauma kept them stuck on the universal level, spiritualizing their problems. This is common in spiritual circles. Whether it's a Buddhist saying that everything is a dream, or a Christian who believes that it's all God's will, these truths can be misused to refuse personal responsibility. Even the most genuine inner spiritual experience won't help us if we place ourselves above the world of form. As Alan Jones, Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, once commented, spiritual experience can actually lead to inflation. There's no one more insufferable than someone who thinks they're more enlightened than anybody else without a certain sense of humor. I know people who on one level are deeply at peace and enlightened and yet go crazy if they miss a bus. On one level, we may still be 5 years old, and on another level be a saint. That's what keeps us humble. That's why religion is very funny. One day a student came to see Ajahn Chah and urgently confided, "Ajahn, I have attained the first level of enlightenment." And Ajahn Chah replied, "Well, that's a little better than being a dog, I guess." This comparison is a terrible insult in Thailand and not said lightly to anyone. Telling the story, Ajahn Chah smiled and said, "The student didn't like that. He went away in a great huff. The enlightened one was angry." We can't pretend we are too spiritual for any experience. If we are angry, Ajahn Chah said, we must admit it, look at its causes, and know its particulars. If we are sad or frightened or ashamed or needy, this is our human condition, the perfect place to practice. Ajahn Chah insisted we could not find freedom and enlightenment somewhere else, only here and now. It is here in the world of form. Only in form can we develop integrity, patience, generosity, truthfulness, dedication, compassion, the great heart of a Buddha. If we fear living the life we're in, Buddhist psychology insists we explore our resistance. If we are caught in fear of failure, in past trauma or insecurity, engaging the world can be difficult for us. We need to make conscious whatever keeps us from living fully. Sharon, at age 48, was a successful human resources director at a Silicon Valley firm. She was an experienced meditator, having done many silent mindfulness retreats and years of Tibetan Buddhist practice. On sabbatical, she came for our 2-month spring retreat at Spirit Rock. Her first 2 weeks were filled with the usual ups and downs of body and memory release, the gradual settling down. When her mind became more silent, the boundaries of her sense of self began to evaporate. Her consciousness opened. She would look at an oak tree and feel her arms as the branches. She would breathe, and the room breathed too. As she became ever more carefully attentive, an almost atomic level of perception was revealed to her. Each sound, each step, each sight broke apart like a pointillist painting. Over the weeks, her senses became a river of thousands of vibrating points of light. At first this was alarming, but with trust she let go into the changing river. One day both herself and the universe itself dissolved, dropping away into luminous emptiness. Later, a tentative sense of self reappeared, and she floated between form and emptiness for some days. She described it as sitting like the Buddha, experiencing a joyful relief, the sweet fruit of years of practice. Several days later, she came to see me, full of tears. From emptiness, she began to come back into her body. It was very hard. She started weeping for her life, which wasn't her life. Uncertain of her meaning, I asked her to explain. She said that her father had always wanted a boy, so much so that, as her mother had told her, when the hospital called him at home to say his wife had given birth to a beautiful baby girl, he misheard them and thought they had said a boy. He even called his friends to announce the birth of his son. Sharon, an only child, was raised to be that son, and she succeeded, doing well in sports and school, tailoring her mannerisms in tomboy fashion to gain her father's love. This had flavored her whole life. Now she looked at me with innocent eyes. In the days before, the emptiness of self had been apparent. Now she was being reborn into the fullness of form. At this moment she looked very young, like a newborn. I told her this was how she appeared to me, and that I wanted to properly welcome her here on this earth as a beautiful girl. I felt like an honored witness to her birth, as if I were in the role of her father. Her eyes moistened, her face grew soft, and then she told me that just before coming to speak with me, she had stepped out of the shower and spontaneously stood naked for a time in front of the big mirror in the women's bathroom. For the first time in her life, she was appreciating her feminine body. Then she stood up, and I too admired her and welcomed her, only wishing I had a pink blanket to wrap around her shoulders. This was the beginning of a whole new life for Sharon. She began playfully exploring her incarnation as a woman, outwardly with a new wardrobe and hairstyle. More importantly, she felt the inner flowering of her feminine nature in all she did. Between the universal and the personal, the realm of concepts. Ajahn Chah used to say, "Use concepts, but do not be fooled by them." The Buddha explained, "When I say Ananda is going to the village for alms, I understand these 5 empty, evanescent processes of body, feelings, perceptions, thought, and consciousness are going to the village, but for convenience I use the term Ananda." When people spoke loosely with Ajahn Chah, generalizing about European people or Thai people, he would smile and ask, "The pious Thai farmer to your left, or the well-known Thai gangster in the local prison?" If you talked about being sad or happy all the time, he might ask, "All the time?" Even in our deepest grief, there come moments when we are busy and forget we are grieving. Even in our greatest joy, some part of us wonders, how long can this last? What comes next? Buddhist psychology believes that healing occurs as we learn to move from the realm of concepts to the world of direct experience. Our mental concepts and ideas about things, about people, objects, or feelings, are static and unchanging, but the reality of experience is an ever-changing river. Direct perception drops beneath the names of things to show us their ephemeral, mysterious nature. When we bring our attention to the direct perception of experience, we become more alive and free. When we hold an apple in our hand, we can call it by its name, apple. Even if we specify that it is a Macintosh or Winesap or Rome Beauty, it remains for us basically an apple. Apple is the name, the concept. The concept doesn't change from day to day. An apple in our lunch is an apple, and even cut up, it's still pieces of an apple. But in the reality of experience, there is no solid apple. The sight of an apple is actually a subtly changing visual pattern, colors of rose and crimson, red and gold, luminous hues that continually transform as the light changes or we move our head slightly. As we pick up the apple, the hard yet soft, fragrant, and cool, waxy skin is changing moment by moment. We then experience the wafting smell, the crunch of its flesh, the complex flavors that unfold in our mouth, cool and delicate as the apple disappears into water and sweetness in our body. The concept of apple is static, an object in thought, but directly seeing, holding, eating an apple is a succession of minute, ever-changing, subtle colors, shapes, and perceptions that are never still for a moment. Everything is like this. On one level, a fixed, seemingly solid world of concepts, but on another, the immediate reality, a stream of 1,000 sense perceptions appearing and disappearing moment after moment. In direct perception, there is no solid apple, and no solid one who perceives it. Paradoxically, of course, we need to use concepts all the time. We need to honor nationality, ownership, time, and the concept of self, even though they do not describe the direct experience of life. With wisdom, we can learn to use concepts without being fooled, lost in them. We have to remember our address and social security number, even though on another level, there is no separate, independent self. When we meet a person, we can see how the concepts of race, class, and gender are true, but they are only a limited part of the story. Beyond concepts, we can see into the true nature of the person before us. In the same way, wisdom reveals that to possess is provisional. We do not possess our house, our car, or our children. We are simply in relation to them. The more tightly we cling to the idea that we own or possess, the greater the unhappiness we reap. With this understanding, we can live as stewards, caring for things, yet not being trapped by the concepts of self and possession. Or consider our common concept of money. Because of our collective agreement, we give immense value to these small printed pieces of colored paper. But we could change our agreement to value candle wax, or even cow patties, and if everyone held this view, they would be our money. How many cow patties are you worth? Ajahn Chah used to ask. I like that. Even time is a concept. In reality, we are always in the eternal present. The past is just a memory, the future just an image or a thought. All our stories about past and future are only ideas arising in the moment. Our modern culture is so tyrannized by goals, plans, and improvement schemes that we constantly live for the future. But as Aldous Huxley reminded us in his writings, an idolatrous religion is one in which time is substituted for eternity. The idea of endless progress is the devil's work, even today demanding human sacrifice on an enormous scale. At the start of a retreat, participants are often invited to remove their watches. In mindfulness practice, we train ourselves to live here and now, for this is where the heart becomes free. The abode of wisdom is now. The changing circumstances of this day are now. When we are not worried about time, we come alive in the present. Living in the present became essential for Margot after her husband Brian was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was an early diagnosis, and after his tumor was removed, his doctors gave him a 50% chance of living for 3 years. Brian, an easygoing man with a history of meditation practice and a good support network that helped him, maintained an attitude of balanced acceptance. Margot was having more trouble than her husband. She couldn't sleep, she worried all the time. After several panic attacks, her distress alarmed her friends and grown children. She came to see me. We began to work on both the universal and the personal level. Brian might well die. Death is natural. Many people have cancer, and some will die this year. Some will live years longer and then die. So will she. This is our human lot. We sat with all her pain, her fears of death, loneliness and abandonment, her regrets, breathing, holding it all with mindfulness and compassion. At the same time, I invited Margot to practice living in the present. Practicing mindfulness, she began to be able to feel her body and focus on its sensations. She could feel her tension, but she could also hear the screech of a scrub jay outside the window and see the slant of the morning light. Coming into her senses, she could see her worry and panic as the product of fearful imagined stories, not as present truths. Margot also learned mindful walking to feel her steps, to touch the earth in the here and now. Through Brian's treatment and hospital visits, his long struggle with cancer, Margot worked diligently with mindfulness to stay in the present. She said it was her only relief. So much of the profound dissatisfaction in modern life arises because we live in increasingly disconnected ways. It is time for us to regain our connection to life. Renowned astrophysicist Victor Weisskopf tells this story. Several years ago, I received an invitation to give a series of lectures at the University of Arizona at Tucson. I was delighted to accept because it would give me a chance to visit the Kitts Peak Astronomical Observatory, which had a very powerful telescope I had always wanted to look through. I asked my host to arrange an evening to visit the observatory so I could look directly at some interesting objects through the telescope. But I was told this would be impossible because the telescope was constantly in use for computer photography and other research activities. There was no time for simply looking at objects. In that case, I replied, I will not be able to come to deliver my talks. Within days, I was informed that everything had been arranged according to my wishes. We drove up the mountain on a wonderfully clear night. The stars in the Milky Way glistened intensely and seemed almost close enough to touch. I entered the cupola and told the technicians who ran the computer-activated telescope that I wanted to see Saturn and a number of the galaxies. It was a great pleasure to observe with my own eyes and with the utmost clarity all the details I had only seen on photographs before. As I looked at all that, I realized that the room had begun to fill with people, and one by one they too peeked into the telescope. I was told that those were astronomers attached to the observatory, but they had never before had the opportunity of looking directly at the objects of their investigations. When we remember who we really are, we bring together the universal with the personal. Instead of becoming more disembodied or rigidly spiritual, we have a sense of humor about the whole dance of life, and everything becomes easier and lighter. We can care for the hydrangeas in our garden, watch our cholesterol, speak out against injustice, and raise money for tsunami and earthquake survivors, and we can meet each person in his or her nobility and timeless beauty beyond age, gender, and race. We can accept the ever-changing seasons of life and know their fleeting ephemeral dance. Honoring the paradox of our true nature, we can laugh with wisdom and tenderly care for the precious days we are given. Practice. Seeing from the universal perspective. Buddhist psychology is filled with practices that shift us to the universal perspective. In one practice, students contemplate the cycles of birth and death, imagining the possibility that they have been born many times. In this reflection, you picture the circumstances of your current life as offering you a perfect chance to learn important and universal lessons. Then you sincerely ask yourself what these lessons might be. Next, extend this universal perspective to a person close to you, a loved one or a close friend. Sit quietly and picture them. Feel how you ordinarily relate to him or her. Now step back in your mind to consider the roles and identities that person inhabits. Male or female, son or daughter, partner, friend, student, teacher, artist, athlete, employee, boss, successes and failures. Step back further and contemplate the unfolding of the person's karma. See how they were born into a certain family. Picture them as an infant, a child, a teenager, adult, an old person. Who are they really? Underneath all the clay of their roles and life stages, what is their essence, their timeless spirit? What are they given an opportunity to learn? What is it like to relate to them outside of their roles, outside of time? In the same way, you can bring a universal perspective to a problem or to a situation where you are stuck in your life. Hold the difficult situation in your mind's eye as if in front of you. Now picture yourself near death at the end of your life and reflect on how you see the problem. Then imagine how many other people have faced a similar problem. Look at it with the perspective of 100 years from now. How does this difficulty appear? Finally, ask yourself how a universal perspective can bring a wise and heartfelt response to the difficulty you face. That's the end of part 1, and then we're going to go next time to part 2, mindfulness, the great medicine.